Good afternoon from the headquarters of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. We are now going to begin the press conference of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bruno Rodriguez in connection with the terrorist attack perpetrated against our embassy in the United States last 30th of April. At the outset, the Minister will make a statement with new information on these very serious events, and afterwards we're going to have a brief Q&A session. Would like to inform that this is an online virtual conference as we observe health measures established in order to fight COVID-19. We are broadcasting live as part of the newscast of the Cuban TV and on the Facebook and YouTube pages of the Foreign Ministry. Minister, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to all those who from their respective homes are following this press conference in Cuba or in other countries. And I reiterate the suggestion, please stay at home. As our people know, on April 30 last at 2:05 in the early hours of morning, there was a shooting attack perpetrated against the Cuban embassy in the United States. The author of the attack was Alazo Baró, whose picture can be seen on the screen, a citizen of Cuban origin living in the United States since 2010. We have recognized the professional and rapid response by the local law enforcement forces and the Secret Service at the moment of the attack. However, I should say that the State Department took almost 5 days to get in touch with the Cuban authorities and issue some sort of official report about this serious incident. The State Department itself and the U.S. government, unfortunately, have chosen to silence this serious terrorist attack. Up until this very moment, there hasn't been any public statement in condemnation of this act or in rejection of any terrorist attack. In view of such a serious situation, it is necessary to denounce the complicit silence of the government of the United States. As video images show, the attacker approached the embassy. He shouted several offensive phrases and threw against the railings a Cuban flag desecrated with several incoherent phrases, after which he tried to set it on fire using gasoline. There was also a shooting attack, as you can see, against an embassy located in downtown Washington, D.C., a few blocks away from the White House, with the use of a semi-automatic assault rifle by an individual who traveled from the state of Pennsylvania carrying the firearm and its rounds. He traveled with the intention of shooting at anything that came in his way, even human beings. He himself has confessed that he acted with intention to kill. It should be pointed out that at the time of the attack and the shooting, because he shot 32 rounds, there were 10 Cuban officials inside the embassy building that was being under attack. It is necessary to ask the U.S. government what are the reasons for its silence and keep this issue away from the public opinion against instead of sending a deterring message as corresponds to its obligation as the venue of diplomatic missions. This is a terrorist action committed against our diplomatic mission in Washington that cannot be seen as a separate issue, but as a result of the aggressive policy and discourse of the government of the United States against Cuba, the hatred speech and the permanent instigation to violence by U.S. Politicians and extremist groups, anti-Cuban extremist groups who have turned these sort of attacks into a way of life. It is known that Alazo Baró planned the attack with enough time beforehand that he visited the crime scene prior to the attack for exploratory purposes, and this happened around 2 weeks before the attack. At the moment of the attack, he declared himself as a follower of the current U.S. president. You already saw the signs desecrating the Cuban flag and wrapped himself up with the flag of the U.S. He didn't put up any resistance when he was arrested, as you have just seen in the video images. In the legal documents available to the public, it is stated that, according to his wife, Alazo Baró visited a hospital where he certainly expressed his persecution delirious thinkings by allegedly criminal Cuban groups. And afterwards, he visited the offices of several law enforcement offices or national security U.S. offices to level accusations against our government and denounce that the Cuban government was allegedly intended to kill him. It is up to the U.S. to explain what kind of consideration was given to the allegations by Alazo Baró, and how did it react when an individual with such characteristics and antecedents is filing accusations before law enforcement agencies against a country with a diplomatic venue in the U.S. territory. I should also say that we appreciate negligence in the behavior of the U.S. government, which did not act in the face of informations of such nature. Mr. Alazo Baró had visited the law enforcement agencies. He had a license to bear weapons. He was the owner of a Glock handgun. During the period previous to the attack, he managed to get an AK-47 rifle, and 2 weeks before, as I said, made an exploration at the place where the embassy is located. The U.S. government did not comply with its obligation to prevent this attack, about which it received enough signals. In the legal documents about the detention, it is claimed that Alazo Baró is a person suffering from some kind of mental disorder. According to his declarations, he was under medications. However, in the documents issued by the U.S. government, it is stated that in the car he was driving, a white powder package was found, which happened to be cocaine. It is known that Alazo Baró was going through financial difficulties. He had gone out of a small business and had no job at the time of the attack. According to his wife, they have gone through periods in which they have not even had a home, a situation that had forced them to live in the car. However, as I said, he is a person that had a license for bearing weapons and also for driving a car. How could the U.S. government have allowed this to happen, knowing about his antecedents? allowing these persons to act this way with premeditation, with the intention of carrying out an aggression and killing people. It is also up to the U.S. government to carry out an exhaustive and thorough investigation that will make it possible to know where did he get the money from. According to legal documents, Alazo Baró was motivated by his hatred towards Cuba and his fears of aggressions by alleged Cuban criminal groups. And everybody knows that these do not exist. It is not that in Cuba there are no criminal organizations or any organized crime. This is too well known by the U.S. government as well as the world over. I should inform that Alazo Baró, during his childhood and youth while he lived in Cuba, kept totally normal social behavior with religious vocation, and as a professional, he devoted himself to the pastoral work. He completed the general military service without any difficulty or without being involved in any relevant incident. In the year 2003, Alazo Baró traveled to Mexico bearing a religious visa to settle there after marrying a Mexican citizen with a similar vocation. He lived in Mexico for several years and kept a normal relationship with Cuba. He traveled to our country 8 times. His most recent visit took place in 2015. That was a relation like those kept by Cubans residing permanently abroad. We must remember that during a normal period, before the tightening of the blockade and the restrictions imposed on Cuban citizens' travels to Cuba, our country was visited by 600,000 Cubans every year. So, as part of the normal relations our country has with the Cubans residing abroad, for the purposes of family reunification and the facilitation of travels and the right to travel, Alazo Baró visited very frequently our country. The last time was in 2015. During his period abroad, he also had regular contacts and received consular services by our offices. So it has been well established that Mr. Alazo Baró never had any problem whatsoever in Cuba or with his country of origin. We should wonder, and we should also ask the United States, how come an individual with a normal religious behavior, a peaceful behavior, is transformed into someone with mental disorders, and being a person with scarce financial resources has managed to own an assault rifle, travel from one state to another within the U.S. territory, and set out to launch an armed attack against a diplomatic mission at the capital of that country. I should say that Alazo Baró, in the year 2010, and even before his most recent travels to Cuba, he moved to the U.S. and settled first in Miami, then in Texas, afterwards in Pennsylvania, and perhaps elsewhere inside the U.S. But it is the obligation of the U.S. government to carry out a profound investigation of the links and connections of Alazo Baró with groups of individuals inside the U.S. with a very well-known background of hatred demonstrations and instigation to violence and even terrorism against Cuba. I can inform today with full responsibility that Alazo Baró, during his stay in Miami, associated himself to a religious center called Doral Jesus Worship Center. The Center for Worshiping Jesus in Doral in Miami-Dade, which is usually approached by persons with a well-established behavior in support of aggression, hostility, violence, and extreme positions against Cuba. In that center, he got in touch with this person who is Pastor Frank Lopez, whom he continuously followed on Facebook. Pastor Lopez is an individual that keeps close links with persons such as Senator Marco Rubio, a Venezuelan citizen, the one that you have just seen on the screen, named Carlos Vecchio, and other persons known for adopting extreme positions against Cuba and promoters of aggressions against our country, including Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart. The Vice President of the U.S., curiously enough, visited a few time ago that church. He did so on February the 1st, 2019, where he made an utterly hostile speech against Cuba, expressing disdain for Latin America and uttering threats against the entire region. Among the persons, Alazo seems to have established close contacts at that church is also an individual of Cuban origin named Leandro Perez, who stated in his Facebook profile that he is a close friend of the shooter, whom he says knows and appreciates. Leandro Perez is known for his public instigations in social networks in favor of assassination plots against heads of state in Cuba. In his allegations, he has referred particularly to violent actions against Army General Raúl Castro Ruz and President Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez. It will suffice it to review right now his accounts in social networks to find instigations as the ones that you are seeing in the screen, calling for carrying out drones attacks against entities in Havana. He used Facebook on February the 5th to try to threaten Cuba by saying that the drones that would be used to attack us were ready to operate. He has also used social networks even to promote the delivery of financial assistance to the terrorists that you are watching on the screen. The anti-Cuban terrorist Raúl Sanchez, whose disrespect for the U.S. law led to a deportation law that has not been materialized, but his links have been widely materialized. Alazo Baró has this Facebook profile. He calls himself Hamilton Alexander, which is a historical character. In that website, he shares the messages of an individual that you are seeing here in the screen who promotes songs of a marginal style and content, which include open instigations to the commission of acts of violence against Cuban diplomatic officials precisely in the United States. In the aforementioned website, you can see his links with the perpetrators of the desecration actions carried out against the Marti sculptures that were offensive to our nation, occurring some months ago. This is something that can be checked out right now by accessing the website and those network accounts. I challenge the U.S. government to disclose what it knows about those links, what it knows about the contacts, as well as the mutual admiration that exists between Alazo Baró and individuals who belong to the groups that support the current U.S. government and are also continuously instigating violence and hatred against Cuba. It is the obligation of the United States government to clarify how the behavior of Alazo Baró may have been influenced by the aggressive feelings against Cuba that are being promoted at the Joel Jesus Worship Center of Miami. What role could have been played by the aforementioned individuals in Alazo Baró's determination to open fire against the Cuban embassy? The complicit silence of the US government authorities turns out to be very suspicious when we know that its law enforcement services continuously and thoroughly monitor the violent groups that act even against Cuba in that country, and they even boast about it. We have every right to ask Secretary of State Mike Pompeo what he knows about these issues, particularly when he usually makes statements regarding Cuba. However, he had not said a single word about the attack that has occurred. It is deplorable that the Secretary of State, while keeping silence on the terrorist attack, has made statements about Cuba, devoting almost daily statements to attack Cuba's medical cooperation and slandering our doctors who work in other countries, even in the midst of the COVID 19 pandemic. The same is being done by his Assistant Secretary of State, who even more frequently and shamelessly publishes on a daily basis absolute lies about the work, dedication, and ethics of Cuba's health professionals, as you have already seen in his account. It is very difficult to dissociate the action carried out by Alazo Baró from the recurrent discourse by U.S. government officials against Cuba. Our international medical cooperation instigating violence against the Cuban medical staff and the continued attacks against our country's diplomatic activity. Any government that applies a genocidal policy, defending as a legitimate thing to punish an entire people that has decided to become free, applying an economic, commercial, and financial blockade that, according to the Convention Against the Crime of Genocide, is classified as an act of genocide, a government that considers as something acceptable to attack the Cuban families. What kind of relationship exists between those policies and these acts? I can affirm decidedly that this attack against the Cuban mission of a terrorist character is a direct result of an official policy of instigation of hatred and violence against my country. Whoever may listen to the customary statements and false allegations by the State Department and the Secretary of State himself will realize that there is a permanent instigation of a feeling of resentment and hatred against Cuba. There are also evidence of the participation of U.S. government officials in the violent actions perpetrated against Cuban health cooperation workers in Bolivia in the aftermath of the coup d'etat in that country. In due time, we provided photographic evidence of the participation of U.S. operatives and even cars bearing American diplomatic plates participating in acts of harassments against Cuban doctors in La Paz. Those who may think are acting in line with the aggressive and hostile policy preached by the US government may feel motivated to commit such violent actions. Those who may think they agree with the messages of violence and hatred against Cuba that are being promoted on a daily basis by radio, television, and social networks, by official personalities and violent groups from the U.S. territory may presume they count on the necessary support to perpetrate actions such as the one that occurred on April the 30th. If there was hatred in the action committed by Alazo Baró, we can affirm that this hatred has been induced by the aggressive discourse of the United States government and the politicians and groups that live on the hostility against Cuba, and also a result of the action of promoting violence that is being done by different groups, particularly in Miami. The Cuban government is waiting for the results of an exhaustive and deep investigation of this terrorist attack. We will see if the government of the US can find some plausible explanation to the links between Alazo Baró and the extremist and violent groups that I have just mentioned, and how he can explain the inescapable link between those individuals and groups and the attack against our diplomatic mission. We will see images that we hope the US government can clarify in due time of persons who, hardly a few hours after the terrorist attack, approach the mission and take photos of the Cuban embassy. These are persons of recognized hostile behavior against that diplomatic mission. I can mention Joaxis Marcheco Suarez and Mario Felix Leonard Barroso. Both of them are habitual participants in harassment acts against Cuban diplomats. In this press conference, I would leave some questions that should be asked to Mr. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It is up to you, Mr. Secretary, to give a response to the U.S. people, to the Cuban people, and the international public opinion about these serious incidents and the inescapable evidence that I have just presented. Nobody could forget the long and cruel history of terrorist actions against Cuba's diplomatic missions in the U.S. and against Cuba's diplomatic officials. 11 martyrs are part of the diplomatic service of Cuba who have been assassinated by terrorist groups. One of them was killed in 1981 at a very centric avenue in Queens in the city of New York. The assassination of the former Chilean Foreign Minister Orlando Letelier at a very centric avenue in Washington is also part of this history. Much of the evidence that exists about the terrorist attack against the Cuban mission are public. Not all of them. These are not the only pieces of evidence. There is also abundant information circulating through social networks and other public media. I reiterate that the US government has chosen to keep silent and refuse to denounce or reject a terrorist action committed against a diplomatic mission in Washington. The shooting attack against the Cuban embassy in Washington using an assault rifle and with the intention to kill is a direct consequence of the U.S. government aggressive policy against Cuba and the tolerance and instigation to violence by extremist anti-Cuban politicians and groups which have turned this type of attack into a way of life. It is secret to no one that sectors that have usually adopted an extremist position towards Cuba have managed to achieve a disproportionate influence in the White House. And some of them are nowadays participating, unfortunately, in the control of the U.S. Cuba policy, which has been denounced in due time by our government. These are the facts around the attack and the deep causes that led to the situation, together with the omission of the U.S. government of denunciating and condemning and their criminal behavior, not to give proper consideration to the information they had beforehand that could have helped to prevent these terrorist action from happening. Thank you very much.
Minister, we have a first question, which is posed by the Washington Post. Are you satisfied with the way in which the local police handled the attack? In my previous press conference, and in this press conference, I have just expressed our recognition to the swift and effective action of the local police and the Secret Service at the right time in order to against the attacker. We have received another question by Grandma newspaper. You have stated that the U.S. authorities have remained silent, including the State Department. Have you received any reactions from other actors in the United States? From many. Several members of Congress and several senators have approached our embassy and our ambassador, condemning the events and expressing their solidarity in face of such a terrorist event like this one. Many American citizens have just done the same thing. Diplomats, ambassadors accredited in Washington have also done it, and we have received messages of condemnation and support in this regard from many countries. And I should also say that many Cubans living in different countries, in particular in the United States, in Florida, in New Jersey, where there is a large community of Cubans, have also addressed our embassy in order to condemn these events. The next question is asked by Channel 10 ABC Miami. Foreign Minister, in one of your tweets you said, and I quote, "It is the state's responsibility to protect accredited diplomats and their premises," unquote. But critics of the Cuban government and officials from the U.S. government have said that the Cuban government did not protect American diplomats in Havana. And the question is, what similarities or what differences are there between these two incidents? I can absolutely confirm that it is an obligation of the state to protect the integrity, the dignity, and the normal operation of a diplomatic mission and the diplomatic staff and their relatives, as Cuba has scrupulously observed. There are some fundamental differences here. The first is that against the American diplomatic staff in Havana, there was not any attack. There was not any deliberate act. I challenge the U.S. government of the U.S. Secretary of State to produce any credible information or evidence in this regard. The members of the press can ask the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States, whose investigation is in line with the outcome of the Cuban investigation, proving that there was no attack or any deliberate act. Secondly, The Cuban government, from the very initial moments in which there was some information in this regard, or in the very few first hours after the US Embassy contacted our foreign minister, and at the highest level, we approached the US government and we offered full information and cooperation and our willingness to receive American investigators and to provide all of their cater to all of their needs, including taking some evidence and samples. We designated a team of experts of the highest international level and proposed a number of cooperation actions, including cooperation between both medical teams, the American and the Cuban medical teams, which the U.S. government rejected or prevented from happening. Thirdly, in connection with the so-called health incidents of American diplomats in Cuba, there is no an author, there is not a perpetrator, a hypothesis, or evidence, or a weapon. In this connection, we have a perpetrator, we have AK-47 rifle, 32 rounds of ammunition, 32 bullet holes, which are a statement of the intent to attack and kill. I remember that in the legal documents, the perpetrator confessed that if anyone had come out of the embassy, he would have fired upon them. And one difference, there would be other differences, but another major difference is Cuba at this time awaits for the result of investigations conducted by the United States government, and we certainly hope that there is an exhaustive, a thorough investigation, and that its outcome is shared with transparency. We also hope for the U.S. government to observe their obligations to adopt sufficient measures in order to prevent that events like this happen again in the future against Cuban diplomats or Cuban diplomatic missions or from any other country in the United States. The Cuban government has not thrown threats, has not applied measures of blockade, has not sent warnings against travelers, has not expelled American diplomats from Havana, has not dismantled its embassy or its consulate offices in Washington. However, all of this was done without any hypothesis, any credible information, and without any piece of evidence by the government of the United States of America against Cuba, with the pretext, with the excuse of the so-called health incidents. I personally traveled specifically to Washington in order to meet with Secretary of State Mr. Tillerson in his office, to whom I expressed our concerns and our commitment to provide full assurances, as we have done in the immaculate history of over these 60 years, to U.S. diplomats or U.S. Delegations in our country. I recall that Mr. Tillerson, when I urged him to look for hypotheses or for evidence, he said that it was not in his interest, that it was enough for him that a so-called event could have happened in Cuba in order to hold the Cuban government responsible and put the blame on them. I hope that Mr. Pompeo, that the State Department and the U.S. government also observe that behavior. The next question is from the AP, and it reads, Minister, some media in the U.S. have stated that the person that attacked the embassy has some mental disorders background. Cuba has suggested that the aggressive rhetoric of President Trump is fueling this kind of attacks. Since the attacker is an emigrated person, does Cuba have medical records or in order to confirm its disease or not? I have stated that his behavior in Cuba was totally normal during the many years when he lived in our country and during his visits to our country. As as it was with his relationship with the Cuban consular offices that provided services to him when he was living overseas. As a result of this, I have to reiterate that there is a connection that cannot be hidden between the aggressive policy of hatred and instigation of violence followed by the U.S. government. Groups of U.S. Politicians and groups of Cuban origins or others with a track record of history have generated the conditions for this attack to take place. I also would like to invite that the U.S. government is asked as to what they know about what is going on at the Doral Jesus Worship Center. One last question, in this case from DPA. Minister, in the aftermath of the embassy shooting, Cuba summoned the Charge d'Affaires in Havana and communicated with the State Department, but there has been no reaction by the U.S. government on this attack. What would be Cuba's next diplomatic step? We are waiting for the United States government to observe their obligations under international treaty. We shall call and urge all instances of the international law, and unless it is appropriate and evident, we shall continue to make this denunciation, and we will continue to ensure the full security of the U.S. Embassy in Havana, its diplomats, and the rest of the embassies. We hope for the U.S. government to at least try to make his rhetoric against terrorism and its policy of fighting international terrorism and make it coherent with its responsibilities in face of a terrorist attack that took place against a diplomatic mission in the Washington downtown. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. And this brings this press conference to an end at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba.